All right, everybody, welcome to the final week. This is the final week, but not the final lecture for Reading, Being, and Time. And I say that because we've broken up Chapter 6 into two chunks to make it a little bit more manageable. So I'm teaching it today, which is a Thursday, July 20th, 2023. And then I will be teaching the second half on Saturday. And so really today is the day that we're going to be focusing on care and, hold on, sorry, it's supposed to be showing this screen right now. Care and anxiety, right? Care and anxiety. Anxiety as the key to unlocking care as the being of Dasein. And we're going to start by focusing on the very beginning of this chapter. Today's going to be a little bit more like the kind of lecturing I keep alluding to, the kind of lecturing that I want to do, the kind of lecturing where I come prepared to talk about the chapter and focus on some passages, but not a lot of slides, not a lot of what I've been doing. And so we kind of did that a little bit last time. I was pretty much, I showed you all a framework for understanding things, and then I fleshed it out using a bunch of quotes. I do have a way of sort of illustrating what we're talking about today, and I will show it, but it's a lot, and it's not the most important thing here. So let's turn to page 225. And I kind of want to hone in on really the first page. So I'm basically just going to do a little exegetical reading of it here. So the section is called The Question of the Primordial Totality of Dasein's Structural Whole. So what is a primordial totality? So we wanted to figure out what is Dasein's constitution. And in developing Dasein's existential constitution, we came to this. This was from last time, you might remember. This right here. It's understanding, discourse, state of mind. They're all equiprimordial. There's no such thing as a Dasein that develops outside of one of these three things. And these three things, understanding, discourse, and state of mind, are the ontological conditions of everything we experience ontically. But what we experience ontically tends to happen within this inner circle as depicted on the screen, which is between ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity. And this ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity is one wherein knowledge is this thing that people say, oh, look at this. And then you go, oh, yeah. And then later you'll be able to reference it by saying, well, you know what they say, or, well, haven't you heard what they say? Right? Kind of passing the word along. You only really should be paying attention to it long enough to figure out what it is that they say. That's why ultimately, whether you have a lot of fact-checking and evidence at work or not, is kind of besides the point. Fact-checking itself becomes one of these signifiers of in-group belonging, right? It's something that we talk about doing. But the tendency that he's focused on here, which is why he calls it a downward plunge, is a tendency of people never getting to the bottom of things. Of things just need to be passed along faster and faster and faster. And part of the reason that we want to pass the word along faster and faster and faster is because we are always, everywhere, already being tempted by anything that is interesting, at least on the surface, insofar as it's able to enthrall us, to draw us away from whatever it is we feel we should be doing, and instead tranquilize us with a feeling of familiarity, a feeling of excitement that leads to familiarity. So it's like the fast acquisition of the novel that makes it familiar, meaning that the background conditions of falling in the world is always this kind of feeling of familiarity, even though everything's always new. Which is to say, functionally, what falling does is it habituates us to a status quo where that status quo is itself constant change. But you make yourself intelligible by how you participate in idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. You make yourself intelligible by what kinds of habits you use to tranquilize yourself. And this is ultimately alienating. So that's what we're talking about when we go to the first page of chapter 6, and the section says, the question of the primordial totality of Dasein's structural whole. The structural whole is what is here on the screen with understanding, discourse, state of mind, ambiguity, idle talk, curiosity at the respective ontological and ontic levels. But of course, it's also being in the world itself, right? Understanding doesn't make any sense outside of modal projection of possibilities. Discourse doesn't make any sense outside of being with, which doesn't make any sense outside of being in, which is to say, always already thrown into a world with others, with language, with discourse. Every idea you've ever had wasn't your own. It was an echo of others. And the tendency for the curation of an I, for the development of an ego, is to make identification claims. I identify with this thought that passed through my head, but then thinking, well, I don't identify with that other thought. I don't identify with that other thought. So an idea passes through the mind, and you snatch at this one and go, yeah, and then that other one you go, no, get away from here. So it's like Fruit Ninja on the one side. No, not mine. And on the other side, you're like, yes, mine. I don't know what game would be the sort of analog here, but is there a game where stuff's falling and you're snatching as opposed to slicing?
You hungry hippo.
We got hungry hippo on the one side, and we got Fruit Ninja on the other side, and people call that thinking, right? Thinking is just being with the ideas that pass through the mind's eye. One of the important things that you can get from meditation as a practice, though I think it's highly overrated, because a lot of what can be achieved through meditation can also be achieved through hiking and journaling and playing musical instruments, and especially philosophy, right? You get a lot of the exact same scientific benefits that they show come from meditation. You get a lot of those benefits from these other activities that are actually in a lot of ways harder. But one of the benefits that comes from meditation is just that practice of letting go of the ideas that pass through the mind and saying, that's not necessarily mine. In fact, I don't even know what I am. In fact, I'm just pure beholding. And these things, it's not me, right? It's not what matters. It just let the ideas pass through. Don't be distracted by them. In a sense, it's allowing you to disassociate from a kind of thinking that is, I think, properly understood as they thinking, right? This is just echoes of discourse, or more likely idle chatter. But state of mind is unthinkable. Curiosity is unthinkable outside of the fact that we are the kinds of beings for whom attunement is always an issue. We're always already attuned to the world, right? And most of the time, we try to counter some kind of a negative attunement with a positive attunement. This is where toxic positivity comes from. People are so set on being positive at any cost that if you were like, oh my God, okay, oh, we're going to be late. There is a lot of traffic. They instantly go, yeah, well, the bright side of that is that we get to talk the whole time. It's just like, calm your tits. I didn't say it's the end of the world. I just pointed out that something's negative, right? I just pointed out that something's not great. Like, we can deal with it. It's fine. But some people are so averse to sitting with something negative, even for a moment. It's like, oh, well, that person, their entire country was devastated, was blown up. They lost their family. They had to come here as a refugee. Oh, well, on the bright side, they get to adopt the American way of life. A lot of people want to come here, right? Like, there's always a bright side, but it's like, it's true. I mean, like, I can look back at all of the bad things that have happened throughout my life, and I can say, without those things, I wouldn't be here. Of course I can do that. But can I sit with the bad things themselves and allow myself to feel them? That's hard. And that's not something that this circle of falling is interested in. Of course, unless oppression becomes something that curiosity, idle talk, and ambiguity starts to celebrate. If that becomes the case, then everybody's going to talk about every little hard thing that's ever happened in their life, and they're going to blow it out of proportion, right? Well, the real reason I said that was because I'm just not well. I struggle. My parents, they did this and they did that, blah, blah, blah. It's like this whole thing, and it's like, it's always this inertia, this plunging into this fallingness, this tranquilizing effect is always one of not taking ownership, of not taking things down to their roots, of not saying, I am responsible for my own immaturity. I am responsible for the self that I'm projecting out, that I am trying to become. I am responsible for the things that I contemplate, consider, reflect on, project, whatever. It's taking responsibility is ultimately the biggest thing that this circle is against, right? Ambiguity allows you to keep shit vague, right? So you get a bunch of people, they're all speaking in a scene or a circle, and it would be impossible for them to be intelligible to one another without a master signifier operative. But that master signifier in its operation essentially doesn't want to be disclosed. So the perfect example of that is leftism. Oh, we're leftists. Oh, the left is this. A real leftist does that. Everything is quilted by this master signifier, which Heidegger would call a for the sake of which. But without that for the sake of which, the whole ground falls out from under everyone and everything, right? Well, some people don't want ground. Getting grounded would require tracing things down to their roots, which would require opting out of this kind of speed that the they is in, which is now the speed of light, as McLuhan would say, right? The speed of light, they time. Remember on 218, he talks about their time as opposed to the kind of time that drills down into things. Arguably, Heidegger really only spent between 16 and 10 years drilling down into things and letting the world pass him by. He obviously wasn't really letting it pass him by. He was well aware of the world historic occasions that were happening around him, but he remained silent on these things, which is, I think, in part why he's patting himself on the back in that section on why people who only ever talk don't even know how to be silent, and that sometimes silence communicates louder than words. So he maintained a silence, or what he calls a reticence, while drilling down into Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Husserl, and the ancients. Not to mention doing an entire lecture course on logic, on Kant, on phenomenology of religion, on hermeneutics. Like, he's doing this whole thing for this big project, for this time, for this big period of time. And it would have been easy to just think, oh, well, he's a nobody. Because, the they's not talking about him. Yeah, but if you actually go to his lecture courses and see where he engages with popular scholars of the day, are any of them familiar names? No. Marx did the same thing with Feuerbach. Did people remember who Feuerbach is? No. And it comes from a resolute commitment to get to the bottom of things and to tarry with the negative and to think through a lot of different perspectives that are contradictory so as to develop an understanding of whatever the subject matter in question actually is. In a sort of sense, he's telling you his secrets in this text. This text is argued to be his magnum opus, even though it was incomplete. I think it's worthy of the name, though, because this is the product of a period of critical production that he kind of just riffs off of for the next 5 years. And then after that 5 years, he's still kind of riffing, but he's also going and doing a little bit more deliberative research through the ancients, right? Getting a lot more into Greek, getting a lot more into poesis, poetry, getting a lot more into interpretation, kind of developing some of his tools so that he can then do an immanent critique of his own earlier positions. Now, these are all questions of method in a sort of sense. This idea of breaking from they time, breaking from constant deference and capitulation to ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity, and leaning in against the temptation to tranquilize and alienate ourselves through constant identification with whatever's trending. Methodologically speaking, you actually have to break from they time. And they time is present at hand. They time is whatever's now. Now this, now this, now this. No striking roots in thought. None. No striking roots into the past. No. We're not personally responsible for interpreting our current situation. It's already been done for us. We just need to make sure that we get the memo in the morning paper, on TikTok, on Twitter, on whatever, right? So I love this beautiful, beautiful illustration, but let's get back to the beginning of chapter 6. He says, the question of the primordial totality of Dasein's structural whole. All right, let's dive into it. What is the question? Being in the world is a structure which is primordially and constantly whole. In the preceding chapters, this structure has been elucidated phenomenally as a whole and also in its constitutive items, though always on this basis, right? We talk about constitutive items, but we always constantly refer them back to the structural whole, which is his foreconception that he is keeping an eye to with foresight as he tries to drill into what he takes to be the forehaving, which is to say a sort of pre-ontological gut sense of the possibilities. Right? We have this kind of gut sense of the possibilities. That's understanding. But atop of that, you always have interpretation through its forestructure of forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Everyone always has a foreconception in all research ever. Him realizing that is why he wrote Being in Time the way he did. He wouldn't have written Being in Time the way he did if he wasn't thinking, I do have a forehaving. And my forehaving is not reducible to my foreconception. And my foreconception is something that I'm always going to be appropriating towards as I go through that which I can pull from my understanding, right? Like he understands this and he's trying to do it methodologically. He's trying to do it responsibly, and he's trying to do it in a way that's explicit so that everybody else kind of gets the clue, like, oh, we all do this. Reading on, the preliminary glance which we gave to the whole of this phenomenon in the beginning has now lost the emptiness of our first general sketch of it. And if I'm not mistaken, chapter 1 was the general sketch of it. But it kind of might actually be better to argue that it's chapter 2 that really gives that preliminary sketch of it. Remember, because he talks about being in. It's not like we're being in a cup. It's not like we're a table next to or touching the wall. No, it's we're being in is, and then he kind of goes into it, but he gives a really, really general sketch that obviously leaves out everything else that we're talking about here. Hold on here. Yeah, it leaves out all of this, for instance, right? Understanding, discourse, state of mind, ambiguity, idle talk, curiosity. How do you, in chapter 2, know what he's talking about when he says being in, when you don't have all of that stuff yet, right? So obviously he's saying, now we've kind of filled this out a bit. To be sure, the constitution of the structural whole and its everyday kind of being is phenomenally so manifold that it can easily obstruct our looking at the whole as such phenomenologically in a way which is unified. So, it's hard to understand how the forest is a forest when we always are going to want to start with individual trees, right? So, yeah, we could take it all apart, analyze all the different flora and fauna that make up the forest. We could factor in latitude and longitude. We could factor in all kinds of unique geographical features that make the biome what it is, that make the environment what it is. But if we just add that all back up together afterwards, it's not the same thing as having a conception before going in. Right? And obviously, any natural science already has a foreconception. So that's just usually not something that gets explicitly worked out in this hermeneutical tradition. So yeah, how to keep it phenomenologically unified when we're talking about being in the world. Being in the world is a lot harder than a forest, right? This is like the perfect point to say, Heidegger is, in a sort of sense, that thinker of when the tree falls in the forest, who hears it? Or does someone hear it? If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if nobody's there to hear it? That's the way people say that. And it's kind of a joke. People don't take it that seriously. But the reason that this is important and that I brought it in at this point in the lecture course is because we already have this saying that you're missing the forest for the trees. Heidegger's the thinker who wants to not miss the forest. He wants to think the forest. But the problem is that the trees and the forest are a lot less complicated than human beings and the kind of being that they have in the world. So if the individual is the tree, the collective is its Dasein? Or is its being in the world? The kind of life that has being in the world is qualified as Dasein, as opposed to these other kinds of life. This is the nature essence, spirit of the forest? Maybe? I don't know. And we'll dwell a little bit on the part here where he talks about the individualizing factor in anxiety and whether this poses a problem for interpreting Dasein as a collective or individual entity. I don't think it does at all. But there's a little caveat I'll have to roll out later. But let's keep reading. But we may look at it more freely, and our unified view of it may be held in readiness more securely if we now raise the question towards which we've been working in our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein in general. So, this first division is our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein in general. And what was the question that we raised towards it in working out our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein? It's this question right here. How is the totality of that structural whole, which we have pointed out to be defined in an existential ontological manner? To say that we want to work it out in an existential ontological manner means not to work it out in an existential ontical manner. We would only be working it out in an existential ontical manner if we were to, say, approach the issue of the difference between the trees and the forest the way that sociologists tend to today. You're only focusing on existential ontic phenomena when you go out and you describe what you're seeing and you walk around asking people interview questions. Right? Because whatever a person answers from their subjective viewpoint is existential with two L's, as opposed to this more full sense of existential. Which is to say that it has to do with their own unique, idiosyncratic, individual ways of experiencing the ontic. The existential with two L's is how you've adapted to the ontic conditions that you've experienced. But the existential ontological conditions of possibility for those existential ontic phenomena is what we're trying to get at. Right? If we can get to some actual existential ontological conditions of possibility for everything that's existential ontic, then what we're going to get is something that will be as relevant to people reading this in 2023 as it was in 2020, or sorry, 1920, or in 2050. The point is we get to something true, that is truer in the deeper sense than, oh, it's just about you and your subjectivity today. It's just about you with your own little personal biography. He says on the second paragraph of page 225, chapter 6, Dasein exists factically. We shall inquire, which, remember, it's just his special word for factually, but it's being used for Dasein as opposed to factual existing things. This is the difference between who and what. He says, we shall inquire whether existentiality and facticity have an ontological unity, or whether facticity belongs essentially to existentiality. Because Dasein essentially has a state of mind belonging to it, Dasein has a kind of being in which it is brought before itself and becomes disclosed to itself in its thrownness. Dasein essentially has a state of mind belonging to it, and because of this, it has the kind of being in which it is brought before itself and it becomes disclosed to itself in its thrownness. But thrownness as a kind of being belongs to an entity which in each case is its possibilities. Right? The term thrownness, developed to indicate this right here, this picture we have up on the screen. Throneness is always already finding ourselves in the middle of all of this. Being thrown into all of this speaks to the fact that you kind of come about realizing, whoa, I'm a person. I've been here for a while. What am I doing here? Everyone keeps telling me what I'm doing here. Everyone keeps telling me who I am and why I am and what's going on, and telling me I'm supposed to basically know what they say they know, but the way that I know what they say they know is by regurgitating what they've told me they know. What they know about me, what they know about my possibilities, and more importantly, what they know about the world and the meaning of our being in it. This is something that I read yesterday at a table across from Anne as we were doing another one of our little time-lapse reading sessions. But my nieces were also there, and one of those nieces is currently a teenager. And it's crazy to read this while being around a thoughtful teenager. Because this is all just, I mean, like, everyone knows this stuff in a sort of sense because of existentialism. But my niece said yesterday, she said, speaking in kind of reference to the prescriptions that she's on, she said, it's like, it's so weird because I don't remember what life was like before the medication. Everyone just tells me what I was like and who I was, and I just don't remember. Like, from her standpoint, she could have just been birthed into the Matrix, and she'd be like, as everyone's like, oh, you're the kind of person who likes this, and you're the kind of person who does that. And she's like, okay, But of course, because everyone has her pegged as a certain type of person, it's not like she's got like this blank slate from which to work, right? Everyone is projecting onto her possibilities. And of course, they're not her own most possibilities, right? Thrownness is an important concept, and falling is just as important. And last time I read this with Brian, something that he was saying was that it's really too bad that there's this sort of religiously loaded language in here, like falling. And I agreed with him, but now I disagree with my former self. I don't think so. Heidegger believes, as the next section you read this week in preparation for the next lecture will prove, he believes that myth provides a pre-ontological disclosure of something about us, that myths that withstand the tests of time get at something true in a pre-ontological way. So part of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater for a hermeneutical phenomenology means you say, well, Christianity's key claim that we are fallen, that shit has something to it. The question is what? If we are to develop that ontologically, we have to go beyond the level of myth and actually kind of drill into what is it that has made it true? What is it that has made it so that over the course of 2,000 years, whenever people hear we're fallen, they go, okay, that rings true. You don't have to take the explicit reasons given to us by pastors and preachers as authoritative on this, because, it's their job to have opinions on what that is and how it works. And it's their job ultimately to interpret the texts that develop these ideas in their sort of pre-ontological way. But the job of the philosopher at this point is to say, yeah, but what's really going on there? And in Heidegger's case, I do think that this is religious. I think that Samuel Loncar is really good for this in his lecture course on Heidegger. He really shows how much of a repressed Catholic Heidegger still is. But I had already brought up the fact that he's not just a repressed Catholic, though. That calling him just a repressed Catholic would be the kind of reduction that lets us off the hook from really having to tarry with or work through this in a very serious way. And obviously, Samuel has tarried with this in a very serious way. He couldn't have written his dissertation on this if he hadn't, not to mention if he hadn't learned German to be able to read it in its original, which is fucking amazing. But it's really easy for people to take something he says and then kind of hand it around and then be like, oh yeah, it's just this old fogey religious thing. When doing so, and I don't think he does this, but it would be really easy to do this with what he does, or with what Loncar has achieved. When doing so would sort of, kind of result in, me and Brian reading this and going, oh my God, it's just religiously loaded, baggage here. He's using this word falling. Instead of hystericizing ourselves when we have that reaction and asking the harder question, which is, okay, yeah, but what if it's true? And more importantly, why would he think that it was true? Or, at this stage in the text, why does he want us to think about this being the case? And I think it is because ontically, which is to say empirically, we discover ourselves as teenagers, which is obviously a recent invention as a category, blah, blah, blah. It's part of the social construction of peer groups through the schooling system, which is a sort of coerced internment facility selectively directed towards rendering us, PMCs or very obedient, and self-flagellating entry level, as they call it, workers. But teenagers, as a peer group, reference something that humans have always had to go through. It's just been kind of given this name, given this little treatment of being this kind of period between innocence and maturity. And it's obviously vague, and people want to draw the lines in different places. But a lot of people can go through being a teenager and then go on into the workforce and get careers even, and end up being mothers and fathers without ever having tarried with the experience that you're actually supposed to be going through as you become a teenager in the first place. Which is to say that you can become an adult and go through life without ever sitting with the anxiety that puberty necessarily forces And that today, there's an actual aversion to puberty, an aversion to maturity, and an aversion to anxiety itself. The anxiety that we're talking about here is not the kind of anxiety that everybody and their mom has today, which is, generalized, anxiety disorder or some spin-off of that, but is arguably, and Heidegger does argue this, the basis of that. Blattner, nod your head if this is true, doesn't Blattner say that it's actually more like depression? Yeah. He says that this anxiety would be better defined as depression. I still don't think that that's completely adequate. Now, we can always get into the technical way in which he differentiates anxiety from fear. We can talk about how he takes that straight from Kierkegaard and never gives credit where it's due. And we will. And we'll get into all of that with this lecture. But for right now, the point is that it also includes the idea of ennui. Let's actually pull up the definition of ennui. Define N-U-I is how it's spelled.
Ennui.
A feeling of listlessness and dissatisfaction arising from a lack of occupation or excitement. People talk about how nowadays they feel compassion fatigue. People feel other kinds of fatigue too. What are some other kinds of fatigue people feel about with this keeping up with what's trending? Outrage fatigue, frustration fatigue, compassion fatigue, alarm fatigue. It results in burnout. It results in sitting back and just saying, I'm no longer excited. Yeah, I might believe that everything's completely fucked and the whole world's falling apart. But what am I supposed to do? Still feel things every time I see a cop kill somebody? I'm still supposed to feel things? I'm sorry. I felt stuff about that like for 6 years. Am I still supposed to feel things about it? I'm numb now. I'm just numb. Like, what are you talking about? The actual example used here in the dictionary, it's the Google dictionary, is he succumbed to ennui and despair. He succumbed to ennui and despair. He succumbed. Succumbing is actually a wonderful word here, since we're kind of playing off of everything on this slide in the first place. Right here. Most of the time we are being tempted to go into tranquilizing ourselves, to be alienated from the burden of existence itself. But when all of those things that tempt us and tranquilize us fail to continue to work, it's like you give up. It's like you just fall over, and that's exactly what the word succumbing to actually gets at. Right? The word succumb gets at the fact that falling is a fleeing from something we're always trying to get away. We're always trying to get away from this thing, which is why we are fleeing. But we experience it as this sort of, at this sort of base phenomenological level, a feeling of ennui, a feeling of falling. And that is to say, a feeling of all the possibilities and things that people keep telling me I should be caring about, thinking about, focused on, having opinions about, feels empty, feels hollow. I'm completely burnt out on all of that. So let's take it back to this word thrownness in the middle paragraph of the second paragraph of the first page of chapter 6, which is 225. He said, but thrownness as a kind of being belongs to an entity which in each case is its possibilities. You feel this disaffection, you feel this burnout, and it has this effect on you because you are your possibilities. But you have this strong sense that these possibilities aren't really yours. That who everyone is telling you you are or have to be isn't really you, doesn't really feel like yourself. So far, you might go, well, Dave, yeah, but this is just Hubert Dreyfus. This is just Blattner. This is just the radical, individualist, existential thing, isn't it? Like, what's the? Aren't we right back to this idea of Dasein as a radical individual with all of this? Yes, if this was an endpoint. But this is the end of Division 1. And he's a German. And Germans want to be structural in everything they do. And they fucking get really hard. They just get this big old hard on for imminent critique. All right, so yeah, the point is that this anxiety that, oh my God, I've been thrown into the middle of this thing. It feels like I'm falling. It feels like I'm losing myself. That is only a rite of passage. Yeah, it individualizes, but that doesn't mean it individualizes you into an individual in any sort of liberal conception of the word individual, right? Is the orator that Heidegger had referenced, is that orator someone who's just an individual? Or is that orator someone who's able to feel the room, read the room, take in the spirit of the times, and direct that spirit of the times towards a more authentic potentiality for being? I don't think that being able to do that is possible if you're just an individual, right? Because you would actually have some kind of an understanding that goes deeper than the ambiguous understanding of the they. You would be engaged in a kind of discourse that is somehow more genuine than the idle talk of the they. And you would have a state of mind that is more in tune with something than this sort of non-committal curiosity. But you'd be able to read the room of what people are concerned with in this circle of the they's, ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity, right? That's the key. Because you are that. You're also not that. But it is the fact that you are that that helps you own that and then direct it towards something better, right? Thrownness should always make you think of this slide. That's what's being referred to. Thrownness as a kind of being belongs to an entity which in each case is its possibilities and is them in such a way that it understands itself in these possibilities and in terms of them, projecting itself upon them. Being alongside the ready to hand belongs just as primordial. And remember, being alongside, we call that being immersed, because that's a poor translation. Being immersed in the ready to hand belongs just as primordially to being in the world as does being with others. And being in the world is in each case for the sake of itself. The self, however, is proximally and for the most part inauthentic, the they self. Being in the world is always fallen. Accordingly, now this is a lot of italics here. So I hope you went crazy with your pen when you were initially underlining. This is very important. Daseins average everydayness can be defined as being in the world which is falling and disclosed, thrown and projecting, and for which its own most potentiality for being is an issue, both in its being alongside the world, which is to say its being immersed in the world of things, and in its being with others. We tend to think of the self as the self-same, that which remains self-same through manifold experiences. That's the subject. That's the traditional subject. And it's the exact same definition as a substance. That which remains self-same through alterations, through having all of its secondary properties removed, through having all of its accidents removed so that all that remains is what was necessary. Self-sameness has now been deconstructed, though. There is no simple me that is my self-sameness. Because my self-sameness is actually always their self-sameness. And that is to say that my self-sameness that I discover I am being told I am responsible for as a teenager, that self-sameness is actually a they self-sameness in the first place. It's their sameness. It's their possibilities being projected. In fact, being a teenager is already a possibility that the they has projected for me. There are right ways or wrong ways of going about being a teenager. There are preferable ways of rebelling in every milieu, right? Conservatives will go, oh, well, you shouldn't be chasing women. But of course they think, well, but if you're a guy, then of course you're chasing women. You're just going to have to get that out of your system before you get married or whatever, right? Now, there's different colors and shades and degrees of this, and I do believe that I grew up in a church where some people genuinely believe, no, you don't even, that's not even what we mean on the sly. You just actually shouldn't be, you should just genuinely be saving yourself for marriage or whatever. But no, but guess what? They're going to feel fine with forgiving you once you get married and, oh, you were just chasing women, as long as you weren't gay. Right? Like, because ultimately, straightness still fits into their overarching worldview. And the same thing goes for if you're on the left. You're supposed to be rebelling against the system. You're supposed to be rebelling against racism, sexism, patriarchy. But you're not going to be able to resist these things in any serious way unless you do X, Y, or Z things. So, of course, then there's like this whole kind of conversation about like, yeah, you should be a rebel. There's a lot to rebel against. In fact, it's the young being angry that is the condition of the possibility of us having hope in the first place. But, of course, the whole thing is they know how you should rebel, and you should be rebelling as a leftist, right? Use your naive, innocent, idealistic standards to judge the corrupted institutions and to hold the officials representative of the left accountable. Yes, absolutely do that. But that's all you should be doing. That's all that the left ultimately means, is this period of Rumspringa before you do your march through the institutions. And I'm using that because it's something I think I had thought this before it came out of Nance's mouth, but ultimately I heard Nance put words to it the first time where he called it a Rumspringa, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's what Amish people at the age of 16 get to go do, which is they grow up sheltered. They're not supposed to use technology. They obviously don't drink or do drugs or have sex, but at the age of 16, they're kind of free to do whatever they want and encouraged to experiment in the devil's playground. And which is the name of a documentary about Rumspringa. But the point is like 99% of them do come back and adopt the Amish lifestyle. And part of the reason that they have such a successful return rate right? Most religions wouldn't have such a successful recuperation factor if it wasn't for the fact that they do free you at the age when you would otherwise break, right? Because if you've been thrown into a world where you don't have, everyone's telling you, well, this is what the real deal is, this is who we really are, your own most potentiality for being in the world is X, Y, and Z things, yeah, you're going to resist that. You're going to hate that. And eventually you're going to rebel against that. And every homeschool cult or fundamentalist family or whatever discovers this the hard way. But the Amish people figured out a way to actually have an amazing recuperation rate. And it's the same tactic that liberals use for keeping teenagers in the fold, which is like this nice little working relationship between protest and corrupt institution, between protester and the elected representative who's taken a long march through the institutions, right? But the point is that these are paths laid out for teenagers. And of course, we find ourselves with paths laid out for ourselves at every stage of life, whether to get married or not to get married, whether how to be in a marriage versus how not to be in a marriage. Everyone's already got it figured out. And the reason everyone already has it figured out is because nobody ever figured it out. Anytime nobody's figured it out, we know everybody already has it figured out. And there's nothing more to see here, folks. You just need to learn how to nod along and say, ah, yes, we know how to raise children. You use discipline and treat them like subhumans versus, no, it's laissez-faire and egalitarian, and you just got to listen and be there for them. And neither of these is a real solution. Neither one of these is going to, both of these can help you respond to certain situations in a seemingly principled way, but neither of these approaches is capable of really getting to know what that other needs in any concrete situation. Because sometimes a person does need a little bit of discipline, and other times a person genuinely just needs you to be there. And no script that was written for you in a parenting book is ever going to tell you that. And of course, people don't even read parenting books. They just watch TikToks from people who ostensibly read some parenting books. But yeah, thrownness is that finding yourself already there going, wait, who am I? Am I really this thing that everyone's telling me that I am? I don't remember that. I mean, I guess when I was a kid, I did some things, and now you've interpreted me as such, and now you project my possibilities as such and such. And so, of course, you feel ennui. Of course, you feel estranged. Of course, you feel anxious. Of course, you feel depressed. You feel all of them. And that all of them is what we're talking about when we say anxiety in a Heideggerian sense. Now, obviously, there's like this more definitional way of approaching it, which is to say, unlike fear, which is actually focused on things in the world, anxiety is about things that aren't there in the world, because it turns back onto the self and thinks about what is your own most potentiality for being, right? So it's the fear of freedom. Yeah, that's a way of talking about it, but I wanted to talk about it in this other more descriptive way and bring in the sort of rite of passage in Rumspringa that we have included in our society called the rebellious teenager phase or whatever, because it's one that people can move through, pass through in a sort of acting way. You can simulate rebellion. You can consume the signifiers of rebellion. And at some point you can say, oh, but I've grown up now. Now I consume the signifiers of growing up. Now I am adulting. That doesn't really mean you've ever tarried with the negative, which is the Hegelian way of saying sitting with this anxiety. this anxiety, which is negativity in its most radical sense, because it's a negativity that neuters the pulsion and significance of the referential totalities that have become circumspectively your world, right? So he said, accordingly, Dazein's average everydayness can be defined as being in the world which is falling and disclosed, right? Being the world is world disclosure. We are the beings for whom world disclosure is what we do. We disclose worlds, right? We erect referential totalities of equipment that have significance, like this emergent property of significance comes from these referential totalities that are based in involvements in all of what I have up on the screen right here. There are understanding ways of dealing with our possibilities that we try to navigate through discourse, that we are able to see through states of mind. And that's disclosure. Being the world which is falling and disclosed throne and projecting. I've already beat this thrownness thing like a dead horse, but projecting, what are we talking about? Obviously, we've been over this before. It's not psychological projection. It is instead thinking forward how you're going to go through something. Now, circumspectively, I don't think about how I'm going to walk through that door when I walk through that door if I'm on my way to go get a drink of water. But I am projecting myself through that door. And I am projecting myself through that door the way someone does it. And that someone is generic, right? Unless I drill in to the possibilities for going through doors. Someone who has drilled into the possibilities for going through doors more than anyone else might discover a way of passing through the door that no one has ever done before, right? But of course, that would still be in reference to the way everyone else is always walking through the door. And Heidegger doesn't think you are authentic if your authentic way of doing something is still in reference to the way everyone else is doing things. It has to be in reference to your own most potentiality for being. It can't be in reference to what everybody else's potentiality for being is, or what they're telling you your potentiality for being is supposed to be. Right? So everybody says, all right, well, you should get a good job. And you go, fuck you, I'll get a shitty job. It doesn't make you authentic. Everyone says you should listen to country, so you listen to punk. Doesn't make you authentic. Everybody says that you should fucking be vulnerable, and so you become a calloused fuck. Doesn't make you authentic. Everyone says you should be, emotionally constipated all the time, so you become hyper vulnerable all the time. Doesn't make you authentic. The point is that this is all in reference to what everyone's saying your possibilities are. And you don't discover what your own most possibilities are by constantly referring back to whatever they're projecting for you. And if you keep going back to the thing that everyone projected for you and then thinking, well, it's mine though. Like, I've always wanted to be this thing, or I've always been the kind of person who does this. You're thinking that your true self is that part of you that is self-same through manifold experiences, as opposed to coming to terms with the fact that what falling means, what thrownness means, is that those things which are closest to you, those kinds of possibilities, you are most used to projecting in a sort of not conscious way even, aren't necessarily your own most. And because the they is an existential, because the they is an existential, and because we can only get relative authenticity and it's never complete, it's always on the basis of inauthenticity that we're able to approximate some kind of authenticity. You'll always be the they self in a sort of sense. The question is, once you do the sort of acid bath that he'll get us into in the next division, what is your own most potentiality for being? Because if you actually know what your own most potentiality for being is, you're not going to be trying to think of, well, what's an authentic way of walking through the door? What's an authentic way of wearing my pants? What's an authentic way of doing fashion? Of doing music? Watching movies? It doesn't matter. You literally won't care. You'll keep doing those things the way that people do them because those things aren't what matters. The thing that matters most to you is the thing that you're going to put all of your time and energy and attention into. And if something else is getting in the way of what ultimately matters, you're going to just, I don't care. So someone says, oh, well, you look like a poser. Oh, you're such a conformist. You go, I put all of my time, my energy, and my attention into what I think matters. And that's all that matters. And you want me to put my time and energy and attention into how I conform or don't conform. And how you're supposed to not conform is a form of conforming, obviously, right? And so that's been the central contradiction for punk ever since the 70s, which is why the truest punks left punk and did emo or whatever. So this is not just about being a teenager. This is about the radical disenfranchisement and estrangement experienced at the time that we go through puberty, but from which we can still flee, from which we can still keep ourselves distracted, through which we can develop they ways of keeping ourselves preoccupied, being tranquilized and alienated, that are inherently, if they are transgressive at all, a part of the system that you are rebelling against anyway, right? So people talk nowadays about having a second puberty, and this is typically the experience of a trans person who's been going through transition and is now getting to re-experience the world as a new person, and is like, oh my God, yeah, no, I'm going through a second puberty. Like all of the things I was experiencing in puberty, I'm now experiencing again. And what I wanted to point out here is that this push to be afraid of puberty, of what puberty actually forces us through, and celebrating a second puberty, all of it gets at something essential about us and about our moment, which is that it's never been so easy to avoid puberty. Now, at a certain level, some people have to deal with it. Like, I mean, everyone at the level of hormones has to deal with it. And of course, if you are able to block those hormones or compensate for those hormones, you're still dealing with it in a sense. You're still responding to it. What I mean is it's never been so easy to deal with it because it's never been so easy to stay tranquilized. Smartphones have made it easier to stay tranquilized than anything else. And of course, it is through smartphones that people are finding out, oh, does everything suck because you're going through puberty or you're about to? Oh, well, there's a cheap way to avoid that. There's a pause button. Didn't you know? But the thing is that there's not a pause button to thrownness. Nothing I'm saying here should be taken as anti-trans. I know it will be taken that way by somebody someday, somewhere. Someone's going to be offended. But what I'm saying is that this essential experience of the facticity of life fucking sucks. These aren't my possibilities. What are they? Is forced by going from the sort of blissful ignorance and innocence of the child into the person that is like, you know what? I'm not what my teachers are telling me I am. I'm not what my parents are telling me I am. And of course, sometimes transness is a way of doing something authentic, perhaps. But if you're getting it off of TikTok as a solution for dealing with a difficult period of time, as a cheap fucking pause button on tarrying with the negative, as a cheap escape hatch from actually realizing your thrownness, then in a sense what's being deferred is growing up. It actually makes me think that anybody who declares themselves as having not gone through puberty shouldn't be allowed to have sex with people who have, because they're still children. You could be 30 years old and never gone through puberty, and you are a child. You shouldn't be allowed to vote. You shouldn't be allowed to lead. You shouldn't be allowed to speak for other people, because you're still a child. A child has not realized themselves as thrown. And they have definitely not tarried with the anxiety. Now, of course, you can always say, well, a person's made it past this arbitrary line in the sand that we drew. Now they are an adult. Congratulations. Yesterday you weren't, today you are. Present at hand analysis has disclosed you as being an adult. Of course, we know that you can be an adult and not be a real woman or not be a real man. You're still a little boy or a little girl in an adult body. Right? Now that's the gender aspect to sex. Of course, that's not the way that it gets talked about today, but yeah, to be able to say, no, you don't get to just say that you're a woman or a man. You actually have to be. And being a woman or a man means not being a little boy or a little girl. So someone says, well, I am a woman because I said so. It's like, well, you might be a little girl, but whether you might be a little girl, but to say that you're not, that your essential characteristic is that you are not a little girl, only time will tell. Right? I would say that more indicative of whether you are a man or a woman beyond genitals is, are you primarily not a little boy or are you primarily not a little girl? If you are a 30-year-old and you are not a little girl, more than you are not a little boy, then maybe you are a woman. I don't know. I'm just putting this out there, but the basic point is that you can put it off, but eventually you'll have to go through it. This is what the midlife crisis is all about. The midlife crisis is what the person goes through when they never took the time to tarry with the negative, and instead they said, no, I'm going to rush forward with the career. You know? Everyone was like, well, I don't want to go into debt, so I'm going to go work this job, or I'm going to go join this apprenticeship program, or, I've got all these scholarships, and so I can go through university. I just have to do it really fast, and I have to constantly have an eye towards my career. Or you can go into the military. All of these are ways of indefinitely deferring, sitting with what Heidegger's talking about. Which is anxiety. Which, I mean, we haven't even started reading the sections on anxiety, much less how those are relevant for understanding care. But I'm kind of just wanting to stay zoomed out like this for the most part, and keep emphasizing the structure of understanding discourse, state of mind, the structure of ambiguity, idle talk, curiosity, the ontological versus ontic levels of this analysis, and how projection is actually probably the most important piece here. Because remember how the book starts out is Dasein is the kind of being for whom its being is an issue. Which is to say, we find ourselves always already losing ourselves. And the fact that we realize I'm losing myself is the indicator that we should be able to win ourselves, right? But you're not winning yourself if a fashion choice or a behavior choice or an identification choice is being rolled out to you as the panacea for being authentic in opposition to the other thrown possibilities being projected for you. Right? Like, no amount of spiking your hair or cutting off all of your hair or growing out all of your hair or cutting off your boobs and getting a boob job or getting on hormone blockers or fucking growing tails and ears and wings, as everybody will likely be doing in 5 years, like, is going to make you any more authentic. I know that, like, everyone in the accelerationist movement thinks that, well, we are essentially the kinds of beings for whom alienation is freedom. And so actually, as long as I'm alienating myself from myself by becoming animal or by becoming dog or by becoming woman, then I'm authentic. Great. And that's the Deluso-Guattarian internet situation that we currently have today. That's what they think. But no, Heidegger would say this is a new form of tranquilizing that is still alienating. Yes, everything is already estrangement because the self is already extimate, which Heidegger calls ecstatic, which is to say standing outside of oneself, which is why we go to this slide now. Oops. Bottom right corner. You can see the stick figures, self-same versus ahead. He hasn't used the term yet outside of oneself, but he has been saying that that the self is already ahead of itself, which means that the self is not the self-same through manifold experiences. Of course, everyone's trying to tell you to be authentic, you have to stay self-same through manifold experiences, meaning that to be authentic, you have to keep being the person that I've told you you are. Because as your parent, as your teacher, as your whoever, sibling, whatever, everyone's going to say, oh, well, we know you as this. And then when you aren't that, they're going to go, that's not you. Right? Heidegger is saying that thrownness is the realization that these scripts and this sort of these molds that are being projected onto the horizon of possibilities ahead of oneself is not actually one's own most. Now, if you're projecting, say, a doctor, everything, and you're serious about it, you're not just wishing for it, which is something that is obviously a tendency, and we'll get into that. But if you're actually like throwing it, projecting it, serious about it, then if that's your ultimate for the sake of which, it really will change everything else. It will actually quilt everything else. So you're like, okay, well, I have to be a doctor because I have to be successful, because I have to be X, Y, and Z. Well, then that's going to change everything else because the referential totality of signification that has been erected to make that a possible path for anyone and everyone, and that's why it's a they possibility. It's all been erected towards that end. Well, guess what? That means other things are going to fall out from sight as meaningful. Someone says, "Oh, well, I'm taking a being in time course this summer. I'm studying being in time this summer, yeah." And someone's like, "Really? well, what are you going to do with your life? That's instantly what they think, because if their ultimate for the sake of which is some specific occupation, they understand everything in reference to that. And then here you are, and they can't even like compare, contrast, judge, equate themselves. They just go, you ain't it. You're not doing the thing. So what are you doing? And because they, when they're not plugged into this, just scroll their phone and jack off, they say, well, you must be scrolling your phone and jacking off. And you say, actually, it's like the hardest book ever written, and it's about everything that it is to be a human, like the most essential things to actually take responsibility in your own life and actually thinking through. They go, you're scrolling and jacking off. That's really what's going on. I understand. It's fine. Everyone bottoms out at some point, they think. But guess what? Next time they bottom out, they're probably going to scroll their phone and jack off for 6 months to 2 years. And then they'll remarry, or they'll get some other job, and then their whole life will repeat itself, because they're trying so hard to maintain this self-sameness, because their actual idea, their foreconception of authenticity itself is so stupid, so simplistic, so backwards, so self-defeating. Now, this is like a sneak peek of how care, concern, solicitude are related, and how care breaks down into the self-sameness versus being possible. And it's just another attempt on my part to kind of put a lot of the different terms being thrown around into a sort of systematic illustration. But I want to go back now to something that I had you all do off camera before I started recording. And we're going to take a moment to talk about method. And so what I had done was I made it so that all of you were in a breakout room. And so just go ahead and unmute yourselves. And you don't have to stop knitting, because I'm happy you're doing it. Crocheting. But I want you all to kind of just talk about the two parts I had you read on page 226 and 229 to 230. And I want you all just kind of like, provoke one another to remember and share out what you came up with for these sections. But first, I'm going to have Nance read the middle paragraph of 226. And Anne did put away the crocheting, and so you didn't have to, but now that you did, you're going to read the paragraph that is at the end of 229 and the beginning of 230. So first, Nance, read that first paragraph, and then you all talk about that paragraph and what you came up with about it, and then Anne will read the other paragraph, and then you all talk about that, and then I will re-intervene it after you've done that.
To put it negatively, it is beyond question that the totality of the structural whole is not to be reached by building it up out of elements. For this, we would need an architect's plan. The being of Dasein, upon which the structural whole as such is ontologically supported, becomes accessible to us when we look all the way through this whole to a single primordially unitary phenomenon, which is already in this whole, in such a way that it provides the ontological foundation for each structural item in its structural possibility. Thus, we cannot interpret this comprehensively by a process of gathering up what we have hitherto gained and taking it all together. The question of Dasein's basic existential character is essentially different from that of the being of something present at hand. Our everyday environmental experiencing, which remains directed both ontically and ontologically towards entities within the world, is not the sort of thing which can present Dasein in an ontically primordial manner for ontological analysis. Similarly, our immanent perception of experiences fails to provide a clue which is ontologically adequate. On the other hand, Dasein's being is not to be deduced from an idea of man. Does the interpretation of Dasein which we have hitherto given permit us to infer what Dasein, from its own standpoint, demands as the only appropriate ontological way of access to itself.
Cool, and then I'll read the next part. Page. Okay. So bottom of 229. So in orienting our analysis by the phenomenon of falling, we are not in principle condemned to be without any prospect of learning something ontologically about the Dasein disclosed in that phenomenon. On the contrary, here, least of all, has our interpretation been surrendered to an artificial way in which Dasein grasps itself. It merely carries out the explication of what Dasein itself ontically discloses. The possibility of proceeding towards Dasein's being by going along with it and following it up interpretively with an understanding and the state of mind that goes with it is the greater, the more primordial is that phenomenon which functions methodologically as a disclosive state of mind. It might be contended that anxiety performs some such function.
What did you guys come up with?
A lot of silence.
Well, in our session, like with the first one, we were just kind of talking about what it means to put it negatively and talking about, the ways in which he's trying to say that we are not just like the sum of everything, we're also, or Dasein is like what it's not. And so just kind of, talking about the ways in which he's building up and characterizing Dasein.
Yeah, I think he's kind of hammering on the like always already there. I don't know, it's hard to put into words, but it's like he's like it's tautological, and that like that's okay. Like, and the only reason that it's like there in the first place is because of that circularity. And that's just what it is. So it's not like you can do 1 + 1 = 2. Like, it really is just like 2 is already 2 in a way.
I like that example. So I want to work through a couple of sections of it, but really quick, is there anything else that any of you wanted to add to that before I kind of just start reading and riffing off of these two paragraphs?
I mean, with the caveat that I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to Kant, but Nance and I discussed Kant a little bit when it came to like experience and how Heidegger is saying it falls short, what does he say? Fails to provide a clue which is ontologically adequate, like our immanent perception of experience. Like how that plays into interpretation. Like it's something we were interested in.
Yeah, that's really good. Absolutely. So part of the kind of middle of the paragraph from 226, he says, I'll just kind of start from the part where it says, the being of Dasein, upon which the structural whole as such is ontologically supported, becomes accessible to us when we look all the way through the whole to a single primordially unitary phenomenon which is already in this whole in such a way that it provides the ontological foundation for each structural item and its structural possibility. Okay, it's a lot of big words for basically we have the whole in view now, right? We've spent a long time developing like what is being in the world, what are its constituent parts. What I have on the screen are only some of its constituent parts because this is basically being in what I have up on the screen, right? The chapter where he develops worldhood is where he develops referential totalities, right? And signification, right? Like that, I can't put it all on the screen, or maybe I could. It would just require a lot more work than I'm currently able to do. But he's saying we've got like this big complex whole now. What Nance said is the 2 before the 1 plus 1, right? So it's the whole. But if we wanted to determine is the being of Dasein itself, which can also kind of be understood as the meaning of Dasein itself, like the meaning of the kind of being that is unique to Dasein itself. He says, now that we have the whole, we can kind of put those on like sunglasses and look at a specific primordial phenomenon, a unitary phenomenon that will give us some kind of unique grasp on the situation. Not a unique, but like a more authentic grasp of what's going on. And that is an indication as to the actual being of Dasein. So where it's going to go is to say that being of Dasein is care. But the way he's going to get there is by saying, through these sunglasses, now we're going to look at the phenomenon of anxiety. Okay. He thinks that to say that the being of Dasein is care is actually something that it's only going to be meaningful now that you've got these sunglasses on of the whole structure he's developed up to this point. But then he says, thus we cannot interpret this comprehensively by a process of gathering up what is hitherto gained and taking it all together. This is another example of what we went over last time, right? It's just you can't break it apart and then just put the pieces back together again. It doesn't work that easily. Break it apart, try to say which linear piece is prior to each other piece, right? Well, you broke up a totality and now you've made it into a linear progression. But a lot of that totality is equiprimordial, which is to say codependent upon one another, upon the terms that are in operation. Hold on one second. Okay. Then he says, the question of Dasein's basic existential character is essentially different from that of a being of something present in hand. Of course, we've been over this. Our everyday environmental experiencing, which remains directed both ontically and ontologically towards entities within the world, is not the sort of thing which can present Dasein in an ontically primordial manner for ontological analysis. Well, and this should make sense at this point because now we've established what everydayness is as that falling, right? So, yeah, we can't just use the interpretations that they has given us here. Similarly, our immanent perception of experiences fails to provide a clue which is ontologically adequate. And Ahmed is pointing out that this is probably a sort of critique of Kant. I mean, it is, but it's a critique of Kant, but Kant is also trying to synthesize empiricism and rationalism. And so this is a critique of all of that. On the other hand, Dasein's being is not to be deduced from an idea of man, right? Oh, we're the rational animal. Okay, what is rationality? Okay, it's kind of like this thing that's more or less like logic. Okay, what are the laws of logic? Okay, now any adequate theory is going to have to be based off of all of that. Well, this is all just a grand deduction off of the initial assertion. And that initial assertion is a specific definition of man, right? He says, does the interpretation of Dasein, which we have hitherto given, permit us to infer what Dasein, from its own standpoint, demands as the only appropriate ontological way of access to itself? Now, Heidegger's a little sneaky, and maybe I should have said this like 5 or 6 lectures ago, but every time he asks a question like this, he always means, yeah, that's exactly right. Every question he ever asks is a leading question. Every time he goes, but what if the being of Dasein is least that which it claims loudest that it is? What he means is it is. That is the problem. And every time he does this, you could almost just follow like the question marks throughout this text as arrows for saying, okay, well, everyone knows where we're at now, but where are we going? The question is always pointing to where we're going. And it's because in his own hermeneutical tradition that he's got here, it's because every interpretation always has foresight towards the foreconception that you had going into the analysis in the first place. And, you know, reading him as though we trust him at this point means that he actually had the entirety of this book more or less worked out, and he's just sitting here working you through the paces, right? And it's a big game of chess, not checkers, right? He has a very long game in view here, which means that he has Division 3 already worked out. That's a crazy... People, I genuinely think that I think that most Americans think that he didn't even have Division 3 worked out yet. He just kind of gave up at some point. It's not... No, he didn't give up because he lost steam or something. No. If you really want to hear my interpretation of what happened, that'll come later. But for right now, my point is that he's got the long game in view here. So yeah, so he says, does the interpretation of Dasein, which we have hitherto given, permit us to infer what Dasein from its own standpoint demands as the only appropriate ontological way of access to itself? Yes, it's anxiety. So let's go back, let's skip forward then to bottom of page 229. Right before that paragraph, he says, within the ontical away from, which such turning away implies, that in the face of which Dasein flees can be understood and conceptualized by turning thither in a way which is phenomenologically interpretive. All he's saying is, look, if you're used to phenomenology, if you are also a student of Husserl like I am, you're not going to really recognize what I'm doing here. This is not really a valid phenomenological maneuver that I'm doing. We can't really understand what this turning away from implies, what this fleeing towards or falling from implies, doing phenomenology, because what we're talking about is something that cannot be seen. What we're talking about is something that's intimately tied up in the Lacanian unconscious. What we're talking about is something that can only be reached hermeneutically, which is why he says that it's something that we have to understand phenomenologically, which he said, how does he say it? Conceptualized by turning thither in a way which is phenomenologically interpretive. Okay, so in orienting our analysis by the phenomenon of falling, we are not in principle condemned to be without any prospect of learning something ontologically about the Dasein disclosed in that phenomenon. Right, because, we're always already there in the midst of it, so it's all circular, so we'll never get outside of it, so how can we actually know anything about it? Therefore, we shouldn't even waste our time trying to interpret what it is to be in the world, because it's all circular anyway. He's saying, no, actually, like this is, we have access to a phenomenon. It's a nice foothold. Now, if he was a champ, he would have actually said, and thank God for Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard made it all clear to me. Without Kierkegaard, I wouldn't have realized that this phenomenon is so essential of a foothold. But of course, he thinks, fuck that Dutch guy. I don't care. I don't know. Actually, I really don't know. The tendency is for us to all say it's messed up, but I actually don't know what German academic standards were like at the time. And when you read continental philosophy, it seems like, yeah, people all just assume you get it, you know. Of course you've read it. It's like, it's like there's a special jouissance that comes from speaking to a room full of people and knowing that only a handful of people are going to get the reference that's operating in the background of what you're saying. Continental philosophy people get a real hard-on for that specifically, and I think German academia itself liked that too. So, you know, if people are reading this in Germany at the time, going, there's Bergson, there's Dilthey, there's Schleiermacher, there's some more Husserl, and and that's directed at Kant, and no, this is directed at Kierkegaard. Okay, yeah. That would make sense. Like, no wonder people are getting so much enjoyment from reading it. It's not just difficult. It's not just a weird way of writing. It's not just intuitive in a sort of counterintuitive way. It's not just helping you see things in a way that you'd never seen them before. No, it's also just like, oh yeah, I'm one of the cool kids. I'm in on the discourse. I know what they're talking about on this page. Was Heidegger getting the enjoyment of doing that in his actual lectures, in his actual writings, and his actual students were all kind of in on that form of enjoyment? So just because it's circular doesn't mean that we're condemned to knowing nothing ontologically about Dasein. Instead, he says, on the contrary, here, least of all, has our interpretation been surrendered to an artificial way in which Dasein grasps itself. It merely carries out the explication of what Dasein itself ontically discloses. This is now the top of 230. He says, the possibility of proceeding towards Dasein's being by going along with it and following it up interpretively with an understanding and the state of mind that goes with it is the greater, the more primordial is the phenomenon which functions methodologically as a disclosive state of mind. It might be contended that anxiety performs some such function. When he says it might be contended, he's saying, I am contending that anxiety does fill this function. Could someone have done this with love? Could someone have said that love is a fundamental, primordial state of mind that discloses things about us that nothing else does? Nance, I want to hear what you said, because I saw you mouth no, and then I heard you say something, or I saw you mouth something else. So what are you?
I don't think so. I think there's a locality in anxiety that love can't. I don't know, because like anxiety, like I don't know how to say it, but like the there-ness isn't necessarily there in love the same way that is necessarily there in anxiety. I think.
The there-ness in nowhere-ness, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think.
I see. I wonder. And I think that what Hannah Arendt is going to argue as a sort of expansion pack on being in time is that Heidegger doesn't ever think natality, which is to say the coming into existence of things. He never thinks about what it means to bring people into the world. He never thinks about what it is to pass on a legacy to another, to have hope and love for children. Like, this is just like all missing. And it's not just children, but it's also newness itself. And Levinas in Totality and Infinity will also take that in a really important direction. It's a direction that tends to make people say he's sexist or backwards or whatever. Like, it's always these progressive woke professors who like to read Totality and Infinity, but as soon as they get to the part that the whole essay is building up to, they all run away screaming. And so, but basically that is like at the sort of most primordial level, it's not like there's, we stare into the gaping abyss of the nothing because we're all gonna die. No, it's we see through the abyss the face of an other that we can actually nurture and pass on life to. And he obviously, to do a sort of phenomenological development of this idea, he goes into the fact that, like, for most people who've ever existed, this is a sexed reality. There's, like, he brings in the voluptuousness of the other and the caress of the other as, like, the whispering of a secret to, like, this something moreness that is there. Beyond lust, there's actually this something moreness there. And it's like, okay. We don't have to get into a rant. We don't have to get into Levinas. I already did. But the point is that, yeah, they do think that there might be some more primordially disclosive phenomenon. But anxiety is a good one. It's a really good one. It's a hell of a good one. And we're not talking about anxiety as the standard way that people talk about it now. The psychologizing way is derivative or downstream from this more expanded version that also includes depression, also includes ennui, right? Going back to the definition of ennui, a feeling of listlessness and dissatisfaction arising from what? A lack of what? Occupation or excitement. Now, of course, occupation can mean a literal job, but really it means being involved in a project that presupposes a referential totality that you understand circumspectively. And Heidegger already said, curiosity is a mood that assails us and delivers us over to idle chatter or idle talk at the point that we are at rest. We're not preoccupied with anything. So it's like right here in the definition of ennui. But of course, we do get preoccupied with whatever the idle talk is telling us we should be preoccupied with. And we get excited about it if we haven't burnt out on that. So we are preoccupied and excited with the they's idle talk. We couldn't be if it wasn't from the fact that we're at a sort of state of rest from whatever the work that we typically are doing is. But of course that burns out eventually. And so then of course you feel ennui, which is existential angst. The reason that this is so perfect of an indicator is because curiosity does burn out. Non-committal curiosity gets boring. If you got into theory and you just binged all the main theory podcasts, all the main philosophy YouTube channels, and you just couldn't get enough of it, but then eventually just felt listless and not occupied anymore, and none of it was exciting, none of it felt new, it's because you've been over it all so much now, but it's not your own most point of entry. You've not developed any rigorous, rooted orientation in that field or kind of grasp of any of it, right? Now, it takes a lot longer to burn out on theory, but the they's got a lot of things you can burn out on. And most of the time, if you meet somebody who's into more than one hobby, it's because they found multiple things to do. Now, they probably wouldn't have done multiple things if it wasn't for the fact that they burnt out on this thing, so then they did this thing, and then they burnt out on that thing, now they did that thing. But now they can kind of go back to these old things, and so they're kind of juggling, revisiting things that they've done before, and that's how they fill their garbage time on the weekend, right? But they're not plugged into some kind of a meaningful way of projecting themselves, right? This is just a way of passing the time. And of course, you get to start to feel listless. And when you feel this, everything else loses significance. Because remember, if you go back to the previous chapter, curiosity is the state of mind you take on when at a point of rest, meaning that the circumspective referential totality of equipment that you are typically sort of unconsciously immersed in, engaged with, operationalizing so as to deal with whatever is the specific issue of concern that day, or specific issues of concern, right? You go to work, you have a job, the tasks that they want you to do, those are the issues of concern. But every time you have concern, what does it require? It requires circumspection. And so that's why up on the screen here I have concern, circumspection. Solicitude, considerateness, forbearance, right? Because circumspection is the background condition of whatever you are focused on in the foreground. That is to say, whatever you're concerned with, or as Husserl would say, whatever is your intentional object. But Husserl focuses on those intentional objects of concern. He doesn't think about circumspection. And he doesn't think about the fact that your actual, that being done at work for the day means that you are cut free from that circumspection in a sort of sense. And that resting is an active way of not being in that referential totality of circumspection that has its own significance. But then he says that in this freedom, you are delivered over to the they. In this freedom from work circumspection and concern, you are delivered over to idle talk. Because the state of mind that you necessarily take on at rest is the state of mind of not having to have any real, tangible, meaningful, circumspective relation to the world. And of course, what we experience today is that the circumspection, the circumspection that you are in at rest kind of never goes away now, because you were always kind of in reference to your smartphone, which is always subscribing to its own little unique pattern of a referential totality of equipment, signifiers, others, that is itself making up this thing. I don't know how to describe it, but it's something that you are in reference to when you're at rest, on the toilet when you're taking a bathroom break, at rest when you get home and sit down with your kids but then straight go to your phone, at rest when you get in the car and are driving places and you want to do stuff on your phone. It's because circumspectively at rest, in order to get a breath of release, of relief, of any sort of distance from what we're supposed to be preoccupied with, we're delivered over to the idle talk, whatever it is that they are saying we have to be hip on at the moment. Right? At the bottom of 230, this goes right along with the cell phone thing. He says, thus the turning away of falling is not a fleeing that is founded upon a fear of entities within the world. Fleeing that is grounded is still less a character of this turning away, when what this turning away does is precisely to turn thither towards entities within the world by absorbing itself in them. The turning away of falling is grounded rather in anxiety, which in turn is what first makes fear possible. Right? It's the fundamental anxiety of not knowing what you are and feeling a terrible weight to have to choose that attunes us to the feeling that there is such a thing as loss in the first place, And the realization and attunement to the idea of loss in the first place primes us for a basic understanding of threat as a phenomenon. And threat is the basis of fear and all of the other kinds of gradations of that affect we talked about last time. But it is at base, he's arguing, this anxiety that makes fear possible. But I think one of the biggest moments that can really just blow you away forever, change you for the rest of your life, contained in this paragraph, comes when he says that falling is a fleeing and that it is a turning away from. Buddhists do this with desire for is desire from. Right? Desire, because the first noble truth is that life is suffering, right? And what makes us suffer but desire? Desire for permanence, for things to not change, right? Desire to hold on to things, right? Desire for my reputation to be good and for people to like me. Well, that's going to bring suffering because people won't, right? Desire to accumulate things. That's going to bring a lot of fucking suffering. But desire towards things is also a desire to avoid other things, get away from things. Thomas Hobbes talks about this too when he's talking about us basically being a bunch of atoms in a void that are driven by desire for and desire from. Like fear of is behind desire to, right? To the point where you go, well, then why would people scroll their phones and look at things that terrify them? Why would people go to scary movies? Why would people sit there and follow hashtags that show them gruesome acts of oppression and violence every day? Well, maybe they feel that they have some kind of an obligation to leave their little privileged bubble and to witness how fucked up reality actually is. That's one reason. Another is because you're afraid. The world is in a terrible crisis today. Yes. But what better vehicle to deliver you over to the they than fear? Your anxiety provoked by sitting with yourself and thinking about what your actual potential is makes you want to flee. And one of the best ways to flee is through fear. You flee confrontation with self and solitude by being delivered over to what the they is telling you should be afraid of today. And it can be genuinely possible to really get yourself riled up, to really actually be angry because other people aren't afraid of some existential crisis that you are attuned to. But yeah, I'm saying that there is this revolutionary little moment. It's a sort of conceptual, it's not a concept itself, but it's instead like a maneuver. And that is realizing that from is for, or for is from. That every time you go, no, that's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because, and then you give some reason about how you want something or you don't want something. And it's yeah, but there's always a flip side to that. Saying that you want this is also a way of saying you don't want something else. This is why the love trumps hate thing doesn't really mean much. Or love trumps fear doesn't really mean much. Is because that, especially we see it with today's left politics, but this kind of love is one that is rooted in fear. right? It's rooted in the fear of, oh, we haven't actually made as much progress as we thought we had. It's rooted in a fear of, oh my God, people disagree with me still. That means we haven't made the amount of progress that I think that we have, right? And of course, the standard line is that it is the conservative whose entire worldview is based in fear. Increasingly, I cannot really see that there's much of a difference between the two political parties at the level of fear. I think that they are both absolutely ballistically angry and terrified of the other. And to be a good citizen, you're supposed to be afraid in one of those two ways. But Heidegger's saying that this fear is downstream from anxiety. Okay, now we've beaten this dead horse enough. But anxiety awakens us to the nowhere-ness, right? I'm going to start in the middle of page 231. Actually, you know what? I want to touch on a couple of things from 231. Right towards the top, he says that anxiety is incapable of having an involvement, right? Remember that referential totalities are based in involvements, right? Which is to say that the hammer belongs to a referential totality of equipment that involves nails and boards and roofs that go on walls, that make up houses, but that all of this is just signifiers and tools that have developed as we have an increasingly sophisticated notion of shelter. But shelter is the primordial involvement behind the workshop. I'm actually in a workshop finally. Isn't this cool? I moved downstairs from where I was last time I lectured, and so now I actually am in a workshop. But this workshop spirals out from that primordial involvement. Anxiety attunes us to no involvement at all, right? And that is to say, it comes about when you feel listless and non-excited and not occupied by any circumspective awareness of any referential totality. And because significance, which is to say like the basis of meaning, is itself conditioned by referential totalities, you feel meaninglessness. He says the world has the character of completely lacking significance at the end of that paragraph on 231. In anxiety, one does not encounter this thing or that thing which, as something threatening, must have an involvement. Accordingly, when something threatening brings itself close, anxiety does not see any definite here or there from which it comes. That in the face of which one has anxiety is characterized by the fact that what threatens is nowhere. Anxiety does not know what that in the face of which it is anxious is. Nowhere, however, does not signify nothing. This is where any region lies, and there too lies any disclosedness of the world for essentially spatial beings. He's saying that just because you feel like you're nowhere, like you're nothing, like there's no meaning, doesn't mean that it is an empty term or that what you're experiencing or able to kind of see in this sense, in this sort of figurative sense, isn't there. It's just that you don't know what it is yet. And it feels unhomelike. It is the unhomeliness that anxiety makes you feel that is the most tried and true experience of teenagerdom and the midlife crisis. What's that song plays on the radio? This house is not my home. Home, this house is not my home. I don't know. I think it's 3 Days Grace. And it's like a old butt rock song from like 15 years ago. But it's the teenage vibe. This house is not my home. I did not make this house. I'm not allowed to just be in my own skin and breathe easy and rest in this house because everybody's on my ass telling me how to be constantly, right? Constantly feeling judged by criteria that you never even consented to in the first place. Or you consented to those criteria before you were ready to, before you even knew what they meant yet. They inducted you before you were even really conscious yet. A little lower, he says, in the face of which one has anxiety, the it is nothing and nowhere becomes manifest. The obstinacy of the nothing and nowhere within the world means as a phenomenon that the world as such is that in the face of which one has anxiety. The utter significance which makes itself known in the nothing and nowhere, the utter insignificance, meaninglessness, which makes itself known in the nothing and nowhere, does not signify that the world is absent, but tells us that entities within the world are of so little importance in themselves that on the basis of this insignificance of what is within the world and its worldhood is all that still obtrudes itself. It's the fact that all of this doesn't mean anything, ultimately, even though everyone keeps telling us that we should care about it, that really drives it home. But that's a really meaningful meaninglessness, in the sense that that's the kind of meaninglessness that should help us kind of get a view of what we actually are. If we actually think it's worth reading an entire text about who we actually are, that leads off with the idea that one of the most essential things about us is the fact that we can lose ourselves. The point is that anxiety is realizing that you've already been losing yourself all along. On page 232, in the middle of the middle paragraph, it says, "The world can offer nothing more, and neither can the Dasein with of others. Anxiety thus takes away from Dasein the possibility of understanding itself, as it falls in terms of the world and the way things have been publicly interpreted." So anxiety makes it possible to stop interpreting yourself in reference to the possibilities of understanding oneself that have been provided in the world. So that means that this kind of, oh, this is not a home, this is not familiar, this thing that feels so familiar is actually not familiar, it feels alien, or I feel alien, that feeling of disengagement and listless, lostness, meaninglessness in the midst of all of this stuff is the condition of possibility for freedom itself. Because it's the condition of possibility for stopping constantly referring everything you think and believe and do to what others think you should believe and think and do. This is why, remember, let's go back to that whole conversation about objective morality. If every time we are talking about it, we're going to refer ourselves back to this term. So we're saying, oh, well, morality is not real because it's not objective. Okay, but who said it has to be objective in order to be real? Oh, that's what they say. That's what they say. Okay, well, why are we letting them define what is real or what matters the most on the basis of this thing called objectivity in the first place? Right? Like, what's this why are we referencing that ideal, which is just das Man? Anxiety throws Dasein back upon that which it is anxious about, its authentic potentiality for being in the world. All right. Whoa. I hope you drew a box around that one. Authentic potentiality for being in the world. Potentiality for being is something he's been throwing around, but now he's just glued it together with being in the world, which is what these last several chapters have been about in the first place. He's bringing it all together here. And the thing that allows us to bring it all together is anxiety itself. Anxiety throws Dasein back upon that which it is anxious about, its authentic potentiality for being in the world. Anxiety individualizes Dasein for its own most being in the world, which as something that understands projects itself essentially upon possibilities. Remember, understanding is always modal. It always has to do with possibilities and projection. It's not just this purely cognitive thing where you crunch present at hand numbers together or whatever. Anxiety individualizes for you by making their possibilities something we don't even have to refer to, because whatever, have fun with that, guys. Don't care. It does nothing for me anymore. Now, if you could find a way of staying busy and always working, while at the same time always being at rest and never not being in a curious and non-committed state of mind, that is to say, you're multitasking, being at rest and working, maybe it would be possible to never feel anxiety. I think that's kind of what we're all doing when we listen to audiobooks while we're working. And then we get back home from work and then we just keep listening. Like, we found a way to stay at rest while working. Which means that, yeah, embodied, you've got a referential totality of equipment that you are in a circumspective relation to as you are concerned with the tasks on hand that you are supposed to be occupied with there at work, or preoccupied with at work. But of course, now you've disassociated from that because you never had any freedom in the first place in that situation. You already felt anxiety in that situation because you were never free from it. And so, of course, in that act of disassociation from manual labor, if you are lucky, you learned how to listen to things while getting stuff done. And that's a condition of possibility for something really cool, but it's also just a condition of possibility for always being at both kind of the non-committal, curious state of detached, idle talk. You know, that's what you're kind of focused on, while nonetheless being immersed in your work. Like somebody who is an engineer it has to give every ounce of thought and their consciousness over to whatever is the object of their concern while they are working, doesn't get to listen to the entirety of Discipline and Punish within a couple of days while working. I got to listen to the entirety of Discipline and Punish while working because I was just chainsawing out in a field, and once you get the basics down, you got it, and you're fine, as long as you've got like these nice sound-canceling headphones. Does that mean that people who have done manual labor actually have a better opportunity of becoming intellectuals with a broader view of things, or that we're actually more primed and ready to kind of just be the they self all the time? Whereas that engineer actually kind of gets to unplug from that they self and actually do something meaningful every once in a while. These are questions that I'm asking as we work through this text. I don't expect to have any serious answers right now, but it's definitely this stuff of, you know, you could easily write a paper about something like that, right? Anxiety individualizes Dasein for its own most being in the world, which, as something that understands, projects itself essentially upon possibilities. Therefore, with that which it is anxious about, anxiety discloses Dasein as being possible, and indeed as the only kind of thing which it can be of its own accord, as something individualized in individualization. Anxiety discloses Dasein as being possible. Not being what it is, self-same. I'm putting my mouse cursor here on the stick person in the slide. Not this, but rather being possible. Realizing that you don't have to be what you are currently thrown as projecting is the condition of freedom. And everybody else's referential totalities of equipment or of the idle talk kind of referential totality that you get through your phone or whatever, falling away, becoming meaningless, that is the opportunity to actually think through your possibilities. So, in a sort of sense, going to the critical media theory discussion and lectures for this month focused on solitude as the sort of condition of authenticity, the condition of freedom, the condition of developing chronological sense of self, a self-esteem, imagination, creativity, skills, having anything to offer whatsoever. It all comes down to genuinely being with oneself. And so there's this whole question of like, can you genuinely be with yourself when you are high? When you are reading novels? When you are just listening to music? Now, obviously, you can find a fullness of being with oneself in such an experience. Like, you can feel fulfilled and just really like, yeah, this is good. But I almost want to say that there's a sort of experience that most people who think they experience solitude is they're still lacking. And that is the experience of subjecting yourself to isolation with the intention of turning that into solitude, right? Because isolation and solitude are not the same thing. Subjecting yourself to isolation for the sake of solitude when the referential totalities have lost their signification. If you're kind of always just going along on the one side concerned with work things and on the other side concerned with cell phone things, then you're not really able to sit with what Heidegger is describing as anxiety, which is the condition of freedom, which is the condition of seeing your own most potentiality for being in the world. If those referential totalities of signification that make up the circumspection as well as considerateness and forbearance of both your rest world through phone and your work world are still charged with significance. In a sort of sense, it makes me say you have to go into solitude when you feel ennui. You have to go into solitude or try to achieve solitude. Try to become the two-in-one, as Arendt would call it. You have to try to do that when you're feeling ennui. Now, of course, I think Arendt would go a little further. She would probably say that also you want to feel conflicted about the things that the they has you doing or saying. Because for her, it's not just being in solitude, and it's not just, sitting with anxiety or tarrying with the negative. It's also asking yourself the hardest question of all, which is, can I live with myself the way that I am? To say that in a more Heideggerian way, can I live with myself as my throne projection being what it is? What about the way that I am projecting myself? What about the way that I'm doing this is unsustainable to the good life? What about projecting myself in this way makes me someone that I actually don't want to sit with? What is it about the way that I'm living that makes me bad company? That's the Arendtian question that is based in this exact same schema, which is why she's the morality and ethics expansion pack. Right? At the bottom of page 232, he says, anxiety makes manifest in Dasein its being towards its own most potentiality for being. That is, its being free for the freedom of choosing itself and taking hold of itself. Anxiety brings Dasein face to face with its being free for the authenticity of its being, and for this authenticity as a possibility, which it always is. But at the same time, this is the being to which Dasein as being in the world has been delivered over. That's kind of where he's getting at the fact that the they self has always already been projected for you. So realizing that you are being possible is also realizing that you're not being necessary. And then that makes you go, oh, so the way that I've been actualizing isn't necessary. It's actually someone else's idea. So I could technically be doing something different. Oh, yeah, that's a condition for freedom. And freedom means nothing if you're German outside of the ability to make a decision. And that's obviously where Division 3 would come in if my interpretation I'm arguing from a few weeks ago has any ground beneath it, right? Now, this is a really important part because he says a lot of stuff in italics right here, and then he says that this is not existential solipsism, okay? Which is to say, not this radical individualism. He says, here, actually, the sentence before it, for as a state of mind, anxiousness is a basic kind of being in the world. Here, the disclosure and the disclosed are existentially self-same in such a way that in the latter, which is to say, the disclosed, the world has been disclosed as world, and being in has been disclosed as a potentiality for being, which is individualized, pure, and thrown. This makes it plain that with the phenomenon of anxiety, a distinctive state of mind has become a theme for interpretation. Anxiety individualizes Dasein and thus discloses it as a solus ipse. But this existential solipsism is so far from the displacement of putting an isolated subject thing into the innocuous emptiness of a worldless occurring that in an extreme sense, what it does is precisely to bring Dasein face to face with its world as world, and thus bring it face to face with itself as being in the world. Okay, but to come face to face with the world does not mean necessarily one's private little world. I don't think Heidegger believes in private little worlds. I don't think Heidegger would even expand the term world so broadly as to include Blattner's little committee that he was sitting on that is coming into tension with being a father, being a husband, being a teacher. That feeling pulled between all those worlds is not necessarily world. So that's kind of where I'll leave that for now as far as chapter 3 goes. Division 3 is going. I do think Division 3 was going in that direction where now he has to actually talk about once you put together time, which is Division 2, existential time, with Division 1, you'll realize that your own most potentiality for being in the world is not this relativizing individualist thing. The rest of this is about care. And the way I want to get to care is by touching on wishing. Because anxiety, we feel anxiety in the face of being torn between a bunch of things that we're supposed to be doing that we don't feel are meaningful, right? But a lot of the time that we spend contemplating those things, those issues, those matters of concern, those goals to be with others or to achieve certain things, what we're really doing is wishing those goals, wishing those things. We're not willing those things in any real sort of sense. That's why I have up here, you can see fear/wishing is what we have for things and others at the level of concern or solicitude. But willing is arguably one of the most important, arguably the most important thing about being a human being. Schopenhauer certainly thought so, as did Nietzsche. Willing is everything. But care is the precondition for will. Now, wishing is what you do when you're totally caught up in falling through the they self. You're just wishing after possibilities that aren't really your own most possibilities. And care, take care, Ahmed. Care is a precondition for being able to fear, for being able to wish, and for being able to will. But more importantly, it's also the precondition for urge itself. Right? Heidegger starts talking about things like pure urge and addiction. And he even touches on a word, drives. Right? Obviously, drives, that's the stuff of psychoanalysis. In the middle of 238, he says the phenomenon of care in its totality is essentially something that cannot be torn asunder, so any attempts to trace it back to special acts or drives, like willing and wishing or urge and addiction, or to construct it out of these, will be unsuccessful. On the top of 239, he says, if willing is to be possible ontologically, the following items are constitutive for it. 1. The prior disclosedness of the for the sake of which in general, right? Because you cannot will something without a goal, and a goal is a for the sake of which. So, having a goal. 2. The disclosedness of something with which one can concern oneself. Obviously, the world as the wherein of being already. 3. Dasein's projection of itself understandingly upon a potentiality for being towards a possibility of the entity willed. In the phenomenon of willing, the underlying totality of care shows through. But care, yeah, it can go into concern when you're dealing with the world of things, and it can go into solicitude when it's dealing with the world of others. But it also can just directly be tied into your authentic for the sake of which is your own most potentiality for being. Concern and solicitude are not just downstream from care, not just presupposing care, but also tend to keep us focused on a whole bunch of other stuff in the average everyday mode that has absolutely nothing to do with your authentic possibilities. I like how he says wish world on the opposite page from where he says they self, right? It's the top of 238 where he talks about, thus when we speak of being ahead of itself, the itself which we have in mind is in each case the self in the sense of the they self. But then on the bottom of 239 he says, in the wish, Dasein projects its being upon possibilities which not only have not been taken hold of in concern, but whose fulfillment has not even been pondered over and expected. On the contrary, in the mode of mere wishing, the ascendancy of being ahead of oneself brings with it a lack of understanding for the factical possibilities. When the world has been primarily projected as a wish world, being in the world has lost itself inertly in what is at its disposal. But it has done so in such a way that, in the light of what is wished for, that which is at its disposal is never enough. That's because you haven't gotten grounded in the circumspective concern. Like, to say, like, okay, no, I want to be president of the United States. Okay, cool. So you're wishing it. You go, oh, no. I've been practicing making speeches. Okay, cool. And yeah, I've also been practicing getting good grades. Okay, yeah. I'm also practicing being popular. Okay. Yeah, I'm doing all of those things. I'm going to become the president. Now, this person's already a little bit more like based than just pure wishing, because at least they're doing something. But the point is that it's mere wishing if the object of concern, the intentional object, is something that you're focused on entirely, but you're not actually taking the time to get to know the circumspection, or to develop the circumspective awareness of the totality, the referential totality that any president presupposes, right? Like, you got to know who's who in terms of where money comes from, where money goes, and who's going to sign what in order to support you or to work against you. You got to actually have a lay of the land, and that lay of the land is circumspective awareness. And yeah, if you were just focused on the intentional object of becoming a president, but you weren't focused on familiarizing yourself thoroughly with that which will then be taken as ready to hand circumspectively, that which makes that object of concern intelligible, right? The referential totality that makes it intelligible in the first place will become impossible. Or it'll at least be very vague, a very, very vague object of intention, which in that case is the exact same kind of ambiguity that we're talking about with falling. And how many people do you meet who are really poor, really, really, really poor, but more than poor, they're poor in spirit, because they spend their whole life scrolling and watching television and wishing that they were a chef or wishing that they were a president. Their discourse is pretty much the discourse of wishing. All right, well, I basically want to close this thing out and say that care is the basis of all that other stuff, and it is the being of Dasein. Okay? But what is care except for the fact that it is the kind of being that we have because we are always thrown out ahead of ourselves, and we give a shit about the fact that we're always being thrown out ahead of ourselves. The kind of concern or solicitude that we are usually involved in is meaningful because we're the kinds of beings for whom being thrown out ahead of ourselves is always the most important thing. Not just the snapshot of where you're at and how you look or how you act in the moment, or how this does or does not relate to some kind of a continuity of self-sameness through manifold experiences. Thank you. That's the lecture, and I look forward to seeing you all on Saturday. So for Saturday, you'll want to read the rest of Chapter 6, and this will be an opportunity for me to focus in on what I have taken to be one of the hardest sections of this text, because there's all this talk of the real versus reality and truth. And, well, truth is usually this thing that's considered to be correlation or coincidence. And no, what we want to get to is disclosure itself is the condition of possibility for truth, as well as any kind of understanding of being. And he has to do this basically like a sort of postmodern epistemology. He has to do this in order to ground out where he's going. And with that, I'll see you all next week. Take care.